Hey everyone! Tonight we're diving into one of history's most devastating chapters, a time when survival wasn't about comfort or convenience, but about making it through each brutal day. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 swept across Europe like a merciless tide, transforming a continent into a wasteland of hunger, desperation, and unimaginable suffering. This wasn't just a bad harvest or a rough winter. This was 7 years of relentless catastrophe that would test every limit of human endurance. So before we begin this journey into darkness, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you genuinely enjoy what we explore here together. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now maybe dim the lights, settle in with that soft background hum of your fan, and let's step back into a time when simply staying alive was the greatest victory anyone could hope for. Picture Europe in the early 14th century, not the romantic medieval world of fairy tales, but a continent balanced precariously on the edge of disaster. The population had been growing steadily for centuries, pushing the limits of what the land could sustain. Fields that had once fed small communities now struggled to support burgeoning towns and cities. Every scrap of fertile ground was under cultivation, from the richest river valleys to marginal hillsides that probably should have been left to the wolves. People were living closer to the edge than they realised, one failed harvest away from catastrophe. The weather had been favourable for generations, warm summers, mild winters, predictable rains that nourished the crops year after year. It was a golden age of agriculture that had lulled Europe into a false sense of security. Farmers planted their fields with confidence, merchants planned their trade routes, and nobles collected their rents, all assuming that the good times would continue indefinitely. But nature, as always, had other plans. The climate was shifting, and the signs were there for anyone who cared to look. Winters grew harsher, summers turned cooler and wetter. Then began to wobble down came the spring of 1315, it, the beginning and width of the end. Instead of the gentle warming rains that farmers prayed for, the heavens opened with a vengeance. Rain fell in torrents, day after day, week after week, transforming fields into swamps and turning roads into rivers of mud. Seeds rotted in the waterlogged soil before they could sprout. Crops that managed to emerge were beaten down by hailstorms or drowned in standing water. The rain didn't just fall, it attacked, as if the very sky had declared war on humanity. By summer, it was clear that something unprecedented was happening. Fields across northern Europe lay under sheets of standing water. Grain that should have been golden and ready for harvest stood stunted and diseased, if it stood at all. The lucky farmers managed to salvage perhaps a tenth of what they'd planted. The unlucky ones watched their entire year's work disappear beneath the relentless downpour. Rivers swollen beyond recognition swept away mills, bridges, and entire villages. The infrastructure of medieval life, built over centuries, crumbled in a matter of months. The first victims were the poor, as they always are in times of crisis. Peasant families who lived from harvest to harvest found themselves with nothing. Stores of grain that might have lasted through a single bad year were exhausted by the second season of failure. Desperate farmers ate their seed grain, the precious stocks meant for next year's planting, knowing full well they were condemning themselves to future starvation, but unable to watch their children waste away in the present moment. As food became scarce, prices soared beyond the reach of ordinary people. A loaf of bread that might have cost a penny before the famine now commanded 10 times that amount, if it could be found at all. Markets that had once bustled with trade fell silent. Merchants hoarded what little grain they could find, waiting for prices to climb even higher. The social fabric that had held communities together for generations began to fray as neighbour turned against neighbour in the desperate struggle for survival. Lords and nobles, cushioned by their wealth and stores, initially weathered the crisis better than their subjects. But as the famine stretched on, Even their resources began to run thin. Castles that had once hosted lavish feasts now served meals of roots and weeds. Armies disbanded because there was no food to feed the soldiers. The entire structure of feudal society groaned under the weight of universal hunger. Cities dependent on the surrounding countryside for food became death traps. Urban populations that had swollen during the good years now found themselves cut off from their lifelines. The complex network of trade and commerce that had made medieval cities possible collapsed almost overnight. Streets that had once echoed with the calls of merchants and the laughter of children fell silent except for the moans of the starving and the rumble of carts carrying away the dead. The psychological toll was perhaps even worse than the physical suffering. This wasn't just hunger, it was the complete breakdown of everything people had believed about their world. The church taught that God rewarded the faithful with prosperity, but now the most devout found themselves watching their children starve. The social order that had seemed as permanent as the mountains began to crumble. Desperate people did desperate things, abandoning the moral codes that had governed their lives, doing whatever it took to find their next meal. Crime soared as law and order broke down. Bands of starving peasants roamed the countryside, taking whatever they could find. Highways that had once been relatively safe became hunting grounds for desperate men who had nothing left to lose. The concept of property became meaningless when the alternative was death. Even the most law-abiding citizens found themselves crossing lines they never thought they would cross, stealing grain from neighbours, raiding abandoned farms, fighting over scraps like animals. The very definition of food expanded to include things that would have been unthinkable in normal times. Tree bark, boiled and ground into a paste, became a delicacy. Grass and weeds were harvested like precious crops. Leather goods were boiled into soup. Anything that might provide even a few calories became fair game. People learned to ignore the taste, the texture, the revulsion, focusing only on the desperate need to fill their stomachs with something, anything, that might keep them alive for another day. Children suffered the most, their small bodies unable to cope with the prolonged deprivation. Parents faced impossible choices, decisions that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Do you give your last crust of bread to your youngest child, or try to preserve the strength of the older ones, who might have a better chance of survival? Do you abandon a sick child to save the healthy ones? These weren't abstract moral dilemmas, but daily realities that tore families apart and left psychological scars that would never heal. The elderly, already vulnerable, simply disappeared. Without the strength to compete for scarce resources, without the energy to forage or fight, they quietly aided away. Their deaths were often seen as merciful. One less mouth to feed, one less burden on families already stretched beyond their limits. The wisdom and experience of generations vanished in the space of a few terrible years, leaving communities not just physically depleted, but culturally impoverished. Disease followed in famine's wake like a faithful companion. Bodies weakened by malnutrition became easy prey for infections that would normally be minor inconveniences. Typhus, dysentery, and other killers swept through communities that had no strength left to resist. The line between death by starvation and death by disease became meaningless. Either way, the result was the same. Mass graves filled with the victims of a catastrophe that seemed to have no end. Villages that had stood for centuries simply ceased to exist, not destroyed by war or natural disaster, but emptied by the slow, inexorable process of famine. Houses stood empty, their doors hanging open, their hearths cold. Fields returned to wilderness. Roads disappeared under weeds. The landscape itself seemed to be forgetting that humans had ever lived there at all. The Great Famine wasn't just an agricultural crisis or an economic disaster. It was a fundamental breakdown of the medieval world, a catastrophe that would reshape European society in ways that are still felt today. It marked the end of the medieval warm period and the beginning of what historians call the Little Ice Age. It was the first crack in the facade of medieval civilization, a preview of the plagues, wars, and upheavals that would define the later Middle Ages. But even as communities collapsed and people died by the thousands, human resilience shone through the darkness. Neighbours who had never spoken before the famine came together to share what little they had. Strangers took in abandoned children. Monks and nuns opened their doors to anyone who needed shelter. Even in the depths of despair, acts of kindness and sacrifice reminded the world that humanity's capacity for compassion could survive even the worst of times. The question isn't whether you would have been brave or clever or resourceful during the Great Famine. The question is whether you would have been lucky enough to live in a region that suffered less than others, lucky enough to have family connections that could provide help, lucky enough to avoid the diseases that stalked the weakened population, lucky enough to find food when there was none to be found. Because in the end, survival during the Great Famine often came down to nothing more than chance. The strong died alongside the weak. The rich suffered with the poor. The pious starved next to the sinful. It was a great leveller, a reminder that for all our human achievements and aspirations, we remain vulnerable to forces beyond our control. The famine tested every assumption about medieval life, every belief about divine providence, every confidence in human civilization. It was a mirror held up to European society, revealing not just its weaknesses, but its capacity for both cruelty and compassion. As we continue this journey into one of history's darkest chapters, remember that behind every statistic, every economic figure, every historical generalization, were real people facing impossible choices and unimaginable suffering. As the Great Famine tightened its grip on Europe, the very foundations of daily life began to crumble in ways that would have been unimaginable just years before. The morning routine that had defined peasant existence for generations, the predictable rhythm of work and rest, planting and harvest, feast and fast, dissolved into a desperate scramble for survival that consumed every waking moment. Picture yourself waking in a medieval cottage as the third year of famine dawned. The straw beneath you, once thick and comfortable, had long since been eaten by the livestock, if any animals still survived. The walls around you, built from wattle and daub, seemed thinner now, less protective, as if the house itself were wasting away along with its inhabitants. The familiar smell of bread baking, the sound of chickens clucking in the yard, the comfortable bustle of a functioning household, all of these had become distant memories, replaced by an oppressive silence, broken only by the constant gnawing of hunger in your belly. Your first thought upon waking wouldn't be about the day's work or the weather or the small pleasures that made life bearable. It would be about food. Where might you find something, anything, to eat today? The obsession with sustenance would dominate every decision, every movement, every interaction. The mental energy that had once been devoted to planning, creating, dreaming, now focused with laser intensity on a single question. How do I survive until tomorrow? The social rituals that had bound communities together for centuries began to warp under the pressure of desperate need. Church services that had once provided comfort and community became gatherings of the gaunt and hollow-eyed, where prayers for deliverance competed with the growling of empty stomachs. The priest, once a figure of authority and wisdom, might himself be reduced to begging for scraps from his equally desperate parishioners. Sunday feasts became Sunday fasts, not by choice but by cruel necessity. Markets, the beating heart of medieval economic life, transformed into scenes from nightmares. Vendors who had once called out cheerfully about their wares now whispered hoarsely about whatever meagre offerings they might have scraped together. A handful of mouldy grain, a piece of questionable meat, roots dug from the forest floor. These became treasures more precious than gold. Fights would break out over a single turnip. Blood would be spilled over a crust of bread. The marketplace, once a centre of civilization, became an arena where humanity's veneer wore dangerously thin. The transformation wasn't just physical, but psychological. People began to move differently, their eyes constantly scanning for opportunities, for threats, for anything edible that others might have missed. Trust, that fundamental currency of human society, became a luxury no one could afford. Neighbours who had shared meals and celebrations now watched each other suspiciously, wondering if the family next door might be hiding food, might be eating better, might be plotting to take what little remained. Children, once the joy and hope of every household, became impossible burdens and heartbreaking responsibilities. Their cries for food echoed through homes where parents had nothing to give. Mothers would chew leather to soften it before feeding it to infants who were too weak to process anything more substantial. Fathers would leave at dawn to forage in forests already stripped bare by thousands of other desperate souls, knowing the odds of finding anything were slim but unable to bear the sight of their families wasting away. The concept of work, of productive labour that had meaning beyond mere survival, essentially disappeared. Craftsmen abandoned their trades because no one could afford their goods, and because the materials they needed were either unavailable or too precious to spare. Blacksmiths melted down tools to make arrowheads for hunting the few remaining wild animals. Weavers unravelled their finest cloths to make nets for catching whatever small creatures might still inhabit the streams and forests. Education, art, literature, all the higher pursuits that mark the difference between civilization and barbarism, withered like unwatered plants. Schools closed because teachers needed to spend their time searching for food. Manuscripts went uncopied because scribes were too weak to hold their pens steady. Songs were forgotten because there was no energy for music, no reason for celebration, no hope worth singing about. The famine rewrote the rules of human interaction in ways both subtle and profound. Hospitality, once a sacred duty throughout Europe, became impossible when offering food to a stranger might mean condemning your own family to death. The elaborate codes of courtesy and honour that governed medieval society seemed absurd when people were fighting over scraps like wild animals. Knights who had sworn oaths to protect the weak found themselves competing with peasants for the same meagre resources. Religious faith, the bedrock of medieval worldview, faced its greatest test. How could a loving God allow such suffering? Why did the innocent perish while the wicked sometimes thrived? Churches that had preached about divine providence and the rewards of righteousness now struggled to explain why good Christians were starving while their prayers seemed to go unanswered. Some found their faith deepened by suffering, seeing it as a test of their devotion. Others lost their faith entirely, concluding that if there was a God, he had clearly abandoned them to their fate. The very landscape began to change as the famine wore on. Fields that had been carefully tended for generations were abandoned when there was no seed to plant or strength to work them. Forests were stripped of everything edible, every berry, every nut, every piece of bark that might be ground into flour. Even the grass was harvested and eaten, leaving bare patches of earth that would take years to recover. The countryside itself seemed to be dying along with its inhabitants. Trade, the lifeblood of medieval Europe, ground to a halt. Merchants who had once travelled confidently along established routes now found themselves targets for desperate bands of brigands who had nothing left to lose. The roads, never particularly safe in the best of times, became killing fields where the strong preyed on the weak and the weak preyed on anyone weaker still. Caravans that had once carried goods between distant cities now carried only the most essential supplies, heavily guarded and moving in fear. The famine created a new geography of survival, where certain locations became magnets for the desperate while others were abandoned entirely. Monasteries with their stores of grain and tradition of charity found themselves besieged by refugees. Some opened their doors and shared what they had until their own supplies ran out. Others barricaded themselves in, choosing to preserve their resources for their own communities rather than watch everyone starve together. Cities dependent on the countryside for their survival became death traps as supply lines collapsed. Urban populations that had grown fat and prosperous during the good years now found themselves completely helpless. lacking even the basic skills needed to forage for food in the wild. The specialized craftsmen and merchants who had made cities possible were utterly unprepared for a world where their skills were useless and their wealth couldn't buy what didn't exist. The psychological toll of watching civilization collapse around you would have been almost unbearable. Every day brought fresh evidence that the world you had known was disappearing, that the future you had imagined for yourself and your children was slipping away like sand through desperate fingers. The comfort of routine, of predictability, of knowing your place in the world, all of this vanished, replaced by an uncertainty so complete it was almost paralyzing. Women faced particular horrors during the famine, their bodies bearing the additional burden of pregnancy and childbirth during a time when adequate nutrition was impossible. Mothers watched helplessly as their milk dried up, unable to nourish the infants who depended on them for life. The maternal instinct to protect and provide for children became a source of agony when protection and provision were impossible. The elderly, already vulnerable in medieval society, faced a particularly cruel fate. Their accumulated wisdom and experience, once valued by their communities, became irrelevant in a world where only physical strength and desperate cunning mattered. Many chose to walk away from their families, disappearing into the wilderness rather than consume resources that might keep younger people alive. It was a final act of love that few would ever know about or remember. Even sleep, that basic refuge from daily suffering, offered no escape. Dreams were filled with visions of food, elaborate feasts that seemed real until the moment of waking brought the crushing reality of empty stomachs and bare cupboards. The boundary between sleeping and waking became blurred as malnutrition affected the mind as well as the body, creating hallucinations and delusions that made it difficult to distinguish between hope and despair, memory and imagination. The famine transformed language itself as new words entered common usage to describe experiences that had no names before. Terms for different types of hunger, for the various stages of starvation, for the desperate expedients that kept people alive. These became part of the everyday vocabulary in a way that would have been unthinkable during times of plenty. Conversations that had once centred on weather and crops and local gossip now focused obsessively on rumours of food, on possible sources of sustenance, on the grim arithmetic of survival. As we delve deeper into this catastrophe, remember that every choice faced by those who lived through the Great Famine was a choice between impossible options. There were no good decisions, only degrees of desperation. The moral frameworks that had guided human behaviour for centuries crumbled under the weight of necessity, leaving people to navigate uncharted territories of ethical compromise and survival instinct. The transformation of human relationships during the Great Famine cut deeper than hunger itself, reshaping the very bonds that held society together. Marriage, once a celebration of love and partnership, became a cold calculation of survival. Young women found themselves bargaining their bodies not for affection or security, but for a handful of grain that might keep them alive another week. Men abandoned wives who could no longer work, children who consumed more than they could contribute, elderly parents who had become burdens rather than blessings. The institution of the family, bedrock of medieval society, buckled under pressures it was never designed to withstand. Parents faced decisions that would haunt them through whatever remained of their lives. When there was only enough food for one child to survive, how do you choose? The strong over the weak, the boy over the girl, the oldest who might remember better times, or the youngest who might see better days? These weren't philosophical debates, but daily realities that tore hearts apart and left psychological wounds that would never heal. Infanticide, once unthinkable in Christian Europe, peered reality, became a huis. Newborns were abandoned at monastery doors, left in forests, or simply allowed to fade away without the nourishment needed for life. It wasn't cruelty, but a desperate mathematics of survival. Better one child should die quickly than an entire family should starve slowly. The moral weight of such decisions crushed spirits as surely as malnutrition crushed bodies. The bonds between master and servant, lord and peasant, that had defined the feudal system for centuries, dissolved in the acid of shared desperation. Knights found themselves begging from the same peasants they had once protected or exploited. Nobles discovered that titles meant nothing when there was no food to buy, and no one left with the strength to show proper deference. The elaborate hierarchy that had seemed as permanent as the mountains proved to be as fragile as morning mist. Criminal behaviour evolved beyond simple theft into something far darker. Cannibalism, the ultimate taboo, emerged from whispered rumours into documented reality. Starving people consumed the dead, then began hunting the living. Travellers who ventured alone onto the roads during the worst years sometimes simply vanished. Their fate a horrible secret, shared only by desperate those enough to cross the final line. Even the mention of such things was enough to drive communities mad with suspicion and fear. The church, that great unifying force of medieval Europe, found its authority crumbling along with everything else. Priests who preached about God's love, while their parishioners starved, lost credibility with every empty sermon. Cathedral treasures were sold to buy grain, then the grain ran out and the treasures were gone forever. Some clergy abandoned their vows entirely, choosing survival over salvation, while others doubled down on faith even as their bodies wasted away at their altars. Superstition flourished in the absence of rational explanation. If God wasn't causing the famine, then perhaps the devil was. Witch hunts began in communities where people needed someone to blame for their suffering. Old women who knew about herbs and healing suddenly found themselves accused of cursing the crops. Jews, always convenient scapegoats in medieval Europe, faced pogroms from mobs who believed they had poisoned the wells or cursed the fields. The concept of law and order, already tenuous in the medieval world, completely broke down in many regions. Courts couldn't convene when judges were starving. Prisons emptied because there was no food to feed the inmates, and no guards strong enough to watch them. Justice became personal and immediate, settled with whatever weapons people could find, in whatever strength they had left to wield them. Education, that slow accumulation of knowledge that had been building for centuries, ground to a halt. Schools closed not just because there was no food, but because there was no point. What use was learning to read when there were no books to spare for fuel? What value had mathematics when the only numbers that mattered were the days since your last meal? Children who might have become scholars or artists or inventors instead learned only the hard lessons of survival. The arts, those expressions of human creativity that had begun to flourish in the high medieval period, withered like flowers in drought. Musicians sold their instruments for food. Painters ground their pigments into paste and ate them. Sculptors broke apart their works to use the stone for grinding grain. Beauty became a luxury that no one could afford, replaced by the brutal aesthetics of survival. Even the most basic human functions became fraught with difficulty. Bathing, never frequent in medieval times, ceased entirely as people lacked the strength to heat water and saw no point in cleanliness when they were slowly dying anyway. Personal hygiene became irrelevant when the choice was between washing and eating always won. The smell of unwashed bodies mixed with the stench of death created an atmosphere of decay that hung over Europe like a shroud. Sleep patterns changed as malnutrition affected the brain. People would lie awake for hours, too hungry to rest, but too weak to move, existing in a twilight state between consciousness and oblivion. When sleep finally came, it brought dreams of food so vivid that waking up became a fresh agony. A daily reminder that the feast existed only in the mind, while the body continued its slow dissolution. The famine created its own economy, a twisted marketplace where traditional values no longer applied. A handful of grain might be worth a horse. A single egg could buy a family's treasured possessions. People traded years of labour for a day's sustenance, selling themselves into bondage for the promise of survival. Debt became meaningless when creditors were as starved as debtors, when the only currency that mattered was calories. Weather took on an almost mystical significance as people scanned the skies for any sign of change. A single day of sunshine could lift spirits across an entire region, while the return of rain brought despair so deep it drove some to suicide. The natural world, once seen as God's creation to be enjoyed and used by humanity, became an enemy, to be feared and fought, a malevolent force bent on human destruction. Children who survived the famine would carry its scars for life, not just in their stunted bodies but in their damaged minds. They would grow up knowing that the world could collapse without warning, that adults were not protectors but competitors, that tomorrow's meal was never guaranteed. These psychological wounds would shape an entire generation, creating a people marked by anxiety, suspicion, and a desperate hoarding instinct that would persist long after the crisis ended. The famine's impact on women was particularly savage, their bodies bearing burdens that went beyond simple hunger. Menstruation stopped as fat reserves disappeared, making pregnancy unlikely but not impossible. Those women who did conceive often miscarried from malnutrition, their bodies too depleted to support new life. The lucky ones gave birth to children who would die within days, while the unlucky ones died in childbirth, their weakened systems unable to survive the trauma. Traditional gender roles, already rigid in medieval society, became even more pronounced as survival strategies focused on whatever advantages each sex might possess. Women's supposed skill at gathering and preserving food became crucial, while men's greater physical strength gave them advantages in the competition for scarce resources. But these same roles could become death sentences when they broke down, leaving people trapped in expectations that no longer matched reality. The elderly faced a particularly cruel irony during the famine years. Their accumulated wisdom about lean times and survival strategies should have made them valuable, but their physical weakness made them liabilities. Many chose to walk away from their families in the middle of the night, disappearing into the wilderness, rather than watch their children choose between feeding them or feeding the grandchildren who might have decades of life ahead. Villages that had existed for centuries simply ceased to function as organised communities. The social structures that had governed daily life, the informal networks of cooperation and mutual aid, the shared traditions and celebrations that bound people together, all dissolved under the pressure of individual desperation. What remained were collections of isolated survivors, each family or individual focused solely on their own struggle to live another day. The Great Famine didn't just kill people, it killed entire ways of life. Farming techniques that had been passed down through generations were abandoned when there was nothing to plant. Craft traditions died with their practitioners. Languages and dialects disappeared when there was no one left to speak them, was. Not just a demographic catastrophe, but a cultural apocalypse, erasing centuries of accumulated human knowledge and experience. Medical knowledge, such as it was in the 14th century, proved utterly inadequate to deal with mass starvation. Physicians who had trained to treat the ailments of the well-fed found themselves helpless before the systematic breakdown of the human body under prolonged hunger. Their expensive treatments and elaborate theories meant nothing when the only real medicine was food, and food was exactly what no one had. The psychological effects of watching civilization collapse around you would have been almost unbearable. Every day brought fresh evidence that the world, as you knew it, was ending, that the future you had imagined was impossible, that the very concepts of progress and improvement were illusions. The despair wasn't just about being hungry, it was about realizing that everything you had believed about life, about society, about God's plan for humanity, was crumbling like poorly built walls in a storm. Trade routes that had connected communities across Europe for centuries became highways of death as the famine wore on. Merchants who had once travelled confidently between cities now moved like hunted animals, their wagons empty or filled with desperate refugees rather than goods. The roads themselves began to disappear under weeds and washouts, as there was no one left with the energy to maintain them. Bridges collapsed and stayed collapsed. Inns shuttered their doors permanently when travellers stopped coming, and there was nothing left to serve those who did. The very concept of money became meaningless in a world where coins couldn't buy what didn't exist. Gold that had once commanded respect and opened doors now served only as weights or pretty trinkets. Silver was melted down to make crude tools for digging roots or stripping bark from trees. The elaborate banking systems that had begun to emerge in medieval Europe collapsed overnight when debts became uncollectible and credit worthless. Wealth accumulated over generations evaporated like morning dew. Seasonal rhythms that had governed human life since the dawn of agriculture lost their meaning when every season brought only disappointment. Spring arrived without the hope of planting, summer passed without growth, autumn came without harvest, winter stretched endlessly without the comfort of stored food. The calendar itself seemed broken, each month indistinguishable from the last in its offering of suffering and want. Religious festivals and holy days, once joyous breaks in the routine of daily labour, became grim reminders of better times. Easter celebrations were held without eggs or meat, or even bread for communion. Christmas arrived without feasts, without gifts, without the abundance that had traditionally marked the season. Saints' days passed unnoticed because there was nothing left to sacrifice, no surplus to share with the divine powers that seemed to have abandoned Europe entirely. Marriage customs adapted to the brutal realities of survival. Young people who might once have courted for months or years now partnered quickly and pragmatically, seeking companions who could help them survive rather than romantic fulfillment. Wedding feasts became impossible dreams, replaced by simple ceremonies where the only exchange was promises to share whatever meagre resources might be found. Many couples never had the chance to marry at all, dying before they could find partners or build the modest prosperity that medieval marriage required. The famine created new forms of migration as people abandoned homes their families had occupied for generations. Entire villages emptied as survivors moved toward rumours of better conditions elsewhere. These migrations weren't organised or planned, just desperate wanderings of people who had nothing left to lose. Roads filled with refugees carrying whatever possessions they could manage, though these loads grew lighter with each passing mile as strength faded and priorities narrowed to the absolute essentials of survival. Children born during the famine years, if they survived at all, grew up in a world completely different from the one their parents had known. They learned to walk on legs weakened by malnutrition, to speak in voices made thin by hunger, to play games that revolved around imaginary food rather than the toys and activities that had entertained previous generations. Their childhood songs were laments rather than celebrations, their stories filled with starvation and death rather than adventure and romance. The sounds of daily life changed as the famine deepened. The cheerful noise of busy communities, the laughter of children, the calls of merchants, the songs of workers, all faded into an oppressive silence, broken only by the moans of the suffering and the prayers of the desperate. Even the animals grew quiet as livestock disappeared and wild creatures fled or died. The countryside fell into a hush so complete it seemed like the world itself was holding its breath. Sleep became both refuge and torment. Exhausted bodies craved rest, but empty stomachs made comfortable sleep impossible. People learned to doze fitfully, conserving energy while remaining alert for opportunities or threats. Dreams filled with visions of abundance became so vivid that many preferred to stay awake rather than face the crushing disappointment of waking to reality. The boundary between sleeping and waking blurred as malnutrition affected minds as well as bodies. Clothing, once a marker of status and season, became purely functional. Rich fabrics were traded for food, fine garments cut up to make patches for more practical wear. Fashion and style became irrelevant concepts when the only consideration was staying warm and covered. People wore whatever they could find, regardless of how it looked or fit, creating a population that moved through the landscape like animated scarecrows. The concept of cleanliness, never a priority in medieval times, disappeared entirely. Water was too precious to waste on washing when it might be needed for cooking whatever scraps could be found. Personal hygiene became an unaffordable luxury. The smell of unwashed bodies mixed with the stench of decay to create an atmosphere that would have been overwhelming in normal times, but became just another aspect of the nightmare that daily life had become. Tools and implements that had been crafted with care and pride were abandoned when there was nothing left to work with them. Ploughs rusted in empty fields, looms gathered dust in silent workshops, cooking pots sat empty beside cold hearths. The accumulated technology of centuries, the patient improvements that had made life gradually more comfortable and productive, became useless artifacts of a vanished world. Books and manuscripts, those precious repositories of knowledge and culture, were burned for fuel when there was nothing else to keep fires alive. Libraries accumulated over centuries disappeared in a few desperate winters. The written record of human achievement and understanding went up in smoke, taking with it not just information, but the very idea that knowledge was worth preserving. Literacy itself became pointless when there was nothing to read and no time for reading, even if books had existed. The famine transformed the very meaning of home from a place of comfort and security into merely a shelter where people waited to die or struggled to survive another day. Houses that had sheltered families for generations stood empty, their doors hanging open, their hearths cold. The concept of property became meaningless when there was nothing left to own, and no one with the strength to defend possessions even if they had existed. Communication between distant places virtually ceased as messengers died or abandoned their routes, and there was no longer anything important enough to justify the dangerous journey between communities. News travelled slowly, if at all, carried by the occasional desperate refugee who might share rumours of conditions elsewhere. The wider world contracted to whatever could be seen from your doorstep, whatever could be reached in a day's week walk. Traditional gender roles both hardened and broke down under the pressure of survival. Women found themselves competing directly with men for scarce resources, while simultaneously being expected to maintain their roles as nurturers and caregivers. Men who had once provided for their families through strength and skill now found themselves as helpless as anyone else, when there was simply nothing left to find or fight for. Children learned lessons that no child should have to learn. They discovered that adults couldn't always protect them, that promises might not be kept, that the world was not the safe and predictable place they had been taught to expect. They aged rapidly, taking on responsibilities and making decisions that would have been unthinkable for young people in better times. Childhood itself became a luxury that few could afford. The elderly found their accumulated wisdom suddenly worthless when the old solutions no longer applied to unprecedented problems. Their stories of past hardships seemed trivial compared to the current catastrophe. Their advice about weathering difficult times proved inadequate for a disaster that exceeded anything in living memory. They became not sources of guidance, but additional mouths to feed at a time when every morsel mattered. Medical care, such as it was, focused entirely on the symptoms of starvation and the diseases that followed in its wake. Physicians abandoned their theoretical knowledge and elaborate treatments, concentrating on the simple task of keeping people alive for one more day. Herbal remedies became impossible to obtain when the plants themselves had been eaten. Surgery was performed without proper tools or materials. Medicine reverted to its most primitive forms when civilization could no longer support its more sophisticated practices. The natural world itself seemed to rebel against human occupation. Trees stripped of bark stood like skeletons against the sky. Fields lay barren and cracked, their soil exhausted and lifeless. Even weeds struggled to grow in earth that had been picked clean of every edible root and shoot. The landscape took on an alien quality, as if the familiar countryside had been transformed into some hellish wasteland where life itself was unwelcome. Weather became an obsession that bordered on madness. People scanned the skies constantly for any sign of change, any hint that the relentless cycle of cold and wet might finally break. A single day of sunshine could lift spirits across an entire region, while the return of clouds brought despair so deep it drove some to take their own lives rather than face another day of suffering. The natural world, once seen as God's gift to humanity, became an enemy to be feared and fought. Time itself became distorted during the Great Famine, as the normal that markers gave structure to human existence slowly disappeared. Days blended into nights in an endless grey haze of suffering. Weeks passed without anything to distinguish one from another. Months stretched like years when every sunrise brought only the promise of more agony. The calendar lost its meaning when there were no seasons to celebrate, no harvests to anticipate, no festivals to mark the passage of time. The human body's response to prolonged starvation followed a predictable and horrifying pattern. First came the gnawing hunger that dominated every thought. Then the body began consuming itself, burning through fat reserves that had never been abundant in medieval peasants. Muscles wasted away, as was can proteinabolized to keep vital organs functioning. Skin became loose and papery, hanging in folds from skeletal frames. Eyes sank deep into skulls, taking on the hollow stare that marked the walking dead. Mental faculties deteriorated, along with physical strength. Memory became unreliable, concentration impossible. Simple tasks that had once been automatic required enormous effort and focus. People forgot the names of neighbours they had known for decades. They lost track of their children in crowds. They wandered away from their homes and couldn't find their way back. The mind, starved of nutrients, began shutting down non-essential functions, leaving only the most primitive drives for survival. Hallucinations became common as malnutrition affected brain chemistry. People saw feasts that weren't there, smelled bread baking in empty ovens, heard the voices of dead relatives calling to them from beyond. The boundary between reality and fantasy blurred until many could no longer distinguish between what was real and what was merely the desperate creation of a dying mind. Some found comfort in these visions, preferring the beautiful lies to the ugly truth of their situation. Families developed their own brutal arithmetic of survival. A grandmother might receive smaller portions than a child who could still work. A sick infant might be allowed to fade away rather than consume resources needed by stronger siblings. These weren't cruel decisions, but calculations of necessity made by people who understood that sentiment was a luxury they could no longer afford. Love became measured not in words or gestures, but in spoonfuls of gruel and scraps of mouldy bread. The concept of work, of productive labour that created value and meaning, virtually disappeared. Craftsmen who had once taken pride in their skills found their trades irrelevant when no one could afford their goods. Farmers had nothing to farm with and nowhere to plant. Merchants had nothing to trade and no one to trade with. The complex economy that had sustained medieval civilization collapsed into a simple equation: find food or die. Children stopped growing, their development frozen by malnutrition. Those who survived would carry the physical marks of the famine for the rest of their lives. Stunted stature, weakened bones, damaged teeth, all permanent reminders of the years when their bodies had been forced to choose between growth and survival. The next generation would literally be smaller, weaker, more vulnerable than their ancestors had been. Social customs that had governed behaviour for centuries crumbled under the weight of desperation. Politeness became impossible when every interaction was about competition for scarce resources. Hospitality, once a sacred duty, became a dangerous luxury that could mean the difference between life and death. Privacy disappeared when families crowded together for warmth and security. Modesty became irrelevant when survival was the only consideration. that mattered. The dead accumulated faster than they could be buried. In normal times, elaborate funeral rites honoured the departed and provided comfort to the grieving. During the famine, corpses were simply dragged to mass graves or left to rot where they fell. There was no energy for digging individual plots, no food for funeral feasts, no strength for the ceremonies that had once marked the transition from life to death. The dead became just another problem to be solved by the living. Language itself changed as new words entered common usage to describe experiences that had no names in better times. Different types of hunger required different terms. The various stages of starvation each had their own vocabulary. Methods of preparing inedible substances into something resembling food developed their own terminology. The famine created its own dialect, a grim lexicon of survival that would persist long after the crisis ended. Religious faith faced its greatest test as people struggled to reconcile their with the evidence beliefs of their senses. How could a loving God allow such suffering? Why did the innocent perish while the wicked sometimes survived? Some found their faith deepened by adversity, seeing the famine as a trial that would ultimately lead to salvation. Others lost their faith entirely, concluding that either God didn't exist or he had abandoned them to their fate. Churches emptied not from lack of belief but from lack of strength to attend services. The famine created new forms of crime that would have been unthinkable in normal times. Grave robbing became common as desperate people searched for anything of value that might be traded for food. Body parts were harvested for their supposed medicinal properties. The recently deceased were butchered for meat by those who had crossed the final taboo. Murder became a means of obtaining victims' meagre possessions. The moral framework that had governed society for generations collapsed under the weight of absolute necessity. Travel became almost impossible as roads deteriorated and bridges collapsed. The network of inns and hostels that had made long-distance movement possible disappeared when there were no travellers to serve and nothing to serve them. Bandits haunted the few remaining routes, preying on anyone desperate enough to venture beyond their own communities. The wider world contracted to whatever could be reached on foot by someone weakened by starvation. Educational systems that had been slowly developing throughout medieval Europe simply ceased to exist. Schools closed when there were no students strong enough to attend and no teachers alive to instruct them. Libraries were raided for fuel, their precious manuscripts burned to provide a few moments of warmth. The patient accumulation of knowledge that had been building for centuries was scattered to the winds in a few desperate years. Artistic expression, those flights of human creativity that distinguished civilization from mere survival, withered like flowers in drought. Musicians traded their instruments for food. Painters ground their pigments into paste and ate them. Poets forgot their verses because beauty had become irrelevant in a world focused solely on staying alive. The cultural achievements that had marked Europe's emergence from the Dark Ages vanished as quickly as they had appeared. Marriage and family formation ground to a halt as young people lacked the resources to establish households or the strength to bear and raise children. Wedding ceremonies became impossible when there was nothing to celebrate with. Dowries disappeared because families had nothing to give. The demographic recovery that would eventually follow the famine was delayed not just by death, but by the years when new families simply couldn't be formed. The concept of property became meaningless when there was nothing left to own and no authority to enforce ownership. Land that had been fought over for generations lay abandoned and worthless. Valuable objects that had been treasured for centuries were discarded as useless weight when people fled their homes in search of food. Inheritance laws became irrelevant when there was nothing to inherit and no one alive to inherit it. Mental illness flourished in the toxic environment of prolonged stress and malnutrition. People who had once been perfectly rational began exhibiting behaviours, exhibiting bizarre talking to imaginary companions, performing meaningless rituals, retreating into fantasy worlds where food was abundant and life was good. The line between sanity and madness blurred when reality itself had become so horrible that escape into delusion seemed preferable. Traditional gender roles both hardened and dissolved under the pressure of survival. Women found themselves competing directly with men for resources, while still being expected to maintain their roles as caregivers and nurturers. Men who had once provided protection and sustenance for their families now found themselves as helpless as anyone else when there was simply nothing left to provide. Children were forced to take on adult responsibilities, while adults reverted to childlike dependence on others for their most basic needs. The elderly faced a particularly cruel fate during the famine years. Their accumulated wisdom about lean times should have made them valuable resources, but their physical weakness made them burdens that communities could no longer afford to carry. Many chose to walk away from their families in the middle of the night, disappearing into the wilderness, rather than consume resources that might keep younger people alive. It was a final act of love that few would ever know about or remember. Medical knowledge, such as it existed in the 14th century, proved utterly inadequate to deal with the systematic breakdown of human health that accompanied mass starvation. Physicians trained to treat the ailments of the well-fed found themselves helpless before bodies that were literally consuming themselves. Their expensive treatments and elaborate theories meant nothing when the only real medicine was food, and food was exactly what didn't exist. The very concept of hope became dangerous during the worst years of the famine. False optimism could lead to poor decisions, wasted energy, and fatal disappointment. People learned to live without expecting improvement, to focus only on the immediate present rather than planning for a future that might never come. The psychological adaptation required to survive such conditions left permanent scars on those who lived through them. Sleep patterns changed dramatically as bodies adapted to starvation. People would lie awake for hours, too hungry to rest comfortably, but too weak to remain active. When sleep finally came, it was often fitful and filled with dreams of food so vivid that waking became a fresh agony. The natural rhythm of rest and activity broke down when neither rest nor activity was possible in any normal sense. Personal hygiene, a high never priority in medieval times, became completely impossible during the famine. Water was too precious to waste on washing when it might be needed for cooking whatever scraps could be found. Soap was an unimaginable luxury. The smell of unwashed bodies mixed with the stench of decay to create an atmosphere that would have been overwhelming in normal times but became just another aspect of the nightmare that daily life had become. Communication between distant communities virtually ceased as messengers died or abandoned their routes, and there was nothing left worth communicating about anyway. News travelled slowly, if at all, carried by occasional desperate refugees who might share rumours of conditions elsewhere. The wider world contracted to whatever could be seen from your doorstep, whatever could be reached in a day's walk by someone weakened by hunger. Traditional seasonal rhythms that had governed agricultural life for millennia lost all meaning when every season brought only disappointment. Spring arrived without the hope of planting, summer passed without growth, autumn came without harvest, winter stretched endlessly without the comfort of stored provisions. The natural calendar that had structured human existence since the dawn of farming became irrelevant in a world where nature itself seemed to have turned hostile. The famine created its own geography of survival and death. Certain locations became magnets for desperate refugees, while others were completely abandoned. Monasteries with their traditions of charity found themselves besieged by hungry crowds until their own resources were exhausted. Cities that had grown prosperous through trade became death traps when supply lines collapsed. The human map of Europe was redrawn by starvation, with population flowing toward rumours of food and away from confirmed disaster. Criminal justice systems that had been slowly evolving throughout the medieval period collapsed entirely when there was no food to feed prisoners and no guards strong enough to watch them. Jails emptied not through mercy, but through abandonment. Laws became unenforceable when survival trumped all other considerations. Justice became personal and immediate, settled with whatever weapons people could find and whatever strength they had left to wield them. The psychological impact of watching children die was perhaps the cruelest aspect of the entire catastrophe. Parents who had brought new life into the world were forced to watch it slowly extinguished by forces beyond their control. The natural instinct to protect and nurture offspring became a source of agony when protection and nurturing were impossible. Many parents died not from starvation, but from the broken hearts that came with outliving their children. Economic systems that had been developing throughout the High Middle Ages simply evaporated when money became worthless and there was nothing left to buy or sell. Banking, that infant industry that had begun to emerge in medieval Europe, disappeared overnight when loans couldn't be repaid and credit became meaningless. Wealth accumulated over generations vanished like morning mist when it couldn't be converted into the only currency that mattered. Calories, the concept of privacy, always limited in medieval society, disappeared entirely as families crowded together for warmth and security. Personal space became an unaffordable luxury when every square foot might mean the difference between shelter and exposure. Intimate relationships were conducted in public because there was no longer any private space where they could occur. The boundaries that had defined individual identity began to blur when survival required absolute cooperation. Religious festivals and holy days that had once provided joyous breaks in the routine of daily labour became grim reminders of better times. Christmas arrived without feasts, Easter passed without eggs, saints' days went unmarked because there was nothing left to sacrifice to the divine powers that seemed to have abandoned Europe entirely. The religious calendar that had structured medieval life became a mockery when every day was a day of suffering. Trade goods that had once connected distant regions of Europe disappeared as both production and transportation became impossible. Luxury items vanished first, then necessities, until finally there was nothing left to trade at all. The commercial networks that had been slowly knitting medieval Europe together dissolved, leaving isolated communities to face their fate alone. Merchants who had once travelled confidently between cities now moved like hunted animals, their wagons empty or filled with refugees rather than goods. The sounds of daily life changed as communities emptied and activities ceased. The cheerful noise of busy towns, the laughter of children, the calls of vendors, the songs of workers, all faded into an oppressive silence, broken only by the moans of the suffering and the prayers of the desperate. Even the animals grew quiet as livestock disappeared and wild creatures fled or died. Europe fell into a hush so complete it seemed like the continent itself was holding its breath. Tools and implements that represented centuries of technological development were abandoned when there was nothing left to work with them. Ploughs rusted in empty fields, looms gathered dust in silent workshops, cooking pots sat empty beside cold hearths. The patient improvements that had gradually made life more comfortable and productive became useless artifacts of a vanished world where productivity and comfort had been possible. Marriage customs adapted to the brutal realities of survival or simply ceased to function entirely. Young people who might once have courted for months now partnered quickly and pragmatically, seeking companions who could help them survive rather than romantic fulfillment. Wedding celebrations became impossible when there was nothing to celebrate with. Many potential couples never had the chance to marry at all, dying before they could find partners or accumulate the modest resources that medieval marriage required. The very meaning of home transformed from a place of comfort and security into merely a shelter where people waited to die or struggled to survive another day. Houses that had sheltered families for generations stood empty, their doors hanging open, their hearths cold. The concept of inheritance became meaningless when there was nothing left to inherit, and often no one alive to inherit it. Family traditions that had been passed down through centuries died with their last practitioners. Clothing evolved from markers of status and season into purely functional items focused solely on survival. Rich fabrics were traded for food, fine garments cut up to make patches for more practical wear. Fashion and style became completely irrelevant when the only consideration was staying warm and covered. People wore whatever they could find, regardless of fit or appearance, creating a population that moved through the landscape like animated scarecrows. The natural world itself seemed to rebel against human habitation. Trees stripped of their edible bark stood like skeletons against the sky. Fields lay barren and cracked, their soil exhausted by desperate attempts to grow anything edible. Even weeds struggled to survive in earth that had been picked clean of every possible source of nutrition. The familiar countryside transformed into an alien wasteland where life itself seemed unwelcome. Children who survived the famine would carry its marks for the rest of their lives, not just in their stunted bodies but in their damaged psyches. They learned that the world was not safe, that adults could not always protect them, that tomorrow's meal was never guaranteed. They aged rapidly, taking on responsibilities that would have been unthinkable for young people in better times. Childhood became a luxury that few could afford when survival required every person to contribute whatever they could to the desperate struggle to stay alive. As we continue deeper into this exploration of humanity's darkest hour, remember that every statistic represents a real person who faced choices no human being should ever have to make. Behind every historical generalization lie countless individual stories of suffering, courage, desperation, and the stubborn refusal to surrender that somehow carried Europe through its greatest trial. The transformation of death itself became one of the Great Famine's most haunting aspects. In normal times, death was a solemn ceremony, surrounded by ritual, prayer, and community mourning. Families would gather around the dying, offering comfort and last rites. Bodies were washed, dressed in their finest clothes, and laid out for proper viewing. Funerals were social events that brought communities together in shared grief and remembrance. During the famine, death became as common as breathing and far less ceremonious. Bodies simply stopped moving, sometimes in the middle of conversations or while walking down roads. There was no time for deathbed vigils when the living barely had strength to tend themselves. No energy for washing corpses when every drop of water was precious. No fine clothes for burial when the dead had worn rags and the living needed whatever fabric remained. Mass graves became the norm, not from disrespect but from sheer necessity. Individual burial plots required energy that communities no longer possessed. Coffins were impossible luxuries when wood was burned for fuel, and craftsmen had starved alongside everyone else. Bodies were wrapped in whatever scraps of cloth could be spared, if they were wrapped at all, then dragged to communal pits that grew larger with each passing day. The stench of death permeated everything. In villages where the living were too weak to bury the dead promptly, corpses lay in streets and homes for days or weeks. The smell became so familiar that people stopped noticing it. Just another aspect of their transformed world. Children played around bodies as casually as they once played around furniture. Death lost its mystery, its terror, its significance, becoming instead just another mundane fact of daily existence. Religious beliefs about death and afterlife faced severe testing when the dying outnumbered the living's ability to provide proper spiritual care. Priests who survived were overwhelmed, racing from deathbed to deathbed to offer last rites, often arriving too late. Many died without confession, without communion, without the spiritual comfort that medieval Christianity promised to the faithful. Families prayed desperately over cooling corpses, begging God to accept souls who hadn't received proper final sacraments. The economic impact of mass mortality created its own set of horrors. In normal times, death meant inheritance, the passing of property, and one generation to the next. During possessions from the famine, inheritance meant in her often nothing but debt and empty buildings. entire family leaving no lines disappear one to claim holdings they're modest. Villages found themselves dotted with abandoned houses whose vanished, leaving behind only the GH owners, had simply os of better times. Labour short, normally mitages that drive up wages, became meaningless when there was no work to be done and nothing to pay wages with. Fields that needed tending lay empty because their owners were dead, and their workers were dead, and there was nothing to tend anyway. The complex web of obligations and services that defined feudal relationships collapsed when both lords and serfs died in roughly equal proportions, leaving no one to enforce the old agreements or honour the traditional duties. Professional mourners, those women who were paid to keen and wail at funerals in some regions, found their services both desperately needed and completely unaffordable. Communities that might once have hired mourners to honour their dead now couldn't spare the energy for grief, much less the resources to pay for its professional expression. Sorrow became a private matter, internalised and silent, because public mourning required strength that was needed elsewhere. Children learned to step over bodies as casually as they once stepped over puddles. Death became so commonplace that it lost impact its emotional, at least on the surface. Young people who should have been traumatised by their first encounter with mortality instead grew up seeing corpses as furniture, obstacles to navigate around, rather than sources of fear or sadness. The psychological damage from this normalisation of death would echo through generations. Animals, both domestic and wild, began feeding on human corpses when no other food sources remained. Pigs, cats, dogs, creatures that had once been fed and cared for by humans reverted to scavengers picking at the flesh of their former masters. The sight of beloved pets gnawing on family, another horror that members became just survivors, learned to accept. The boundary between human and animal blurred when both species were reduced to the same desperate scramble for survival. Burial customs that had been practiced for centuries disappeared almost overnight. Graves that would normally be marked with wooden crosses or carved stones went unmarked because there was no wood or stone to spare. Family burial plots where generations had been laid to rest were abandoned as families died out or fled. The connection between the living and the dead, so important in medieval spirituality, was severed by the simple impossibility of maintaining proper burial grounds. The smell of funeral pyres became common in areas where burial was impossible due to frozen ground or lack of strength for digging. Bodies were burned in mass cremations that would have been considered pagan abominations in normal times, but became necessary expedients when the alternative was disease and decay. The smoke from these fires hung over Europe like a permanent reminder of mortality, visible from miles away and unmistakable in its origin. Record-keeping, that careful documentation of births, deaths, and marriages that was slowly developing in medieval Europe, simply ceased in many regions. Parish priests who might normally record every death in their communities died themselves, or fled, or simply gave up trying to count casualties that mounted faster than they could write. Entire communities vanished from the historical record, not because they weren't important, but because there was no one left alive to document their passing. Professional grave diggers, where they existed, either died or abandoned their trade when payment became impossible and the work became overwhelming. Families that might once have paid for proper burial services found themselves dragging their own dead to whatever communal disposal sites remained accessible. The dignity that had once surrounded death disappeared along with the economic structures that had supported it. Medical professionals, such as they were in medieval Europe, found themselves utterly helpless before the scale of mortality. Physicians trained to treat individual patients couldn't cope with entire populations dying simultaneously. Their theoretical knowledge about disease and healing proved worthless when the only real cause of death was starvation, and the only real cure was food that didn't exist. Many doctors died alongside their patients, victims of the same forces they were powerless to combat. The psychology of survival began changing as people adapted to constant death around them. Emotional numbness became a protective mechanism, allowing the living to function despite being surrounded by horror. Grief became a luxury that required energy better spent on staying alive. People learned to turn away from dying neighbours, to step over corpses, to ignore the cries of the abandoned sick, not from cruelty, but from the recognition that sympathy was a sentiment they could no longer afford. Legal to handle individual systems, designed deaths and inheritances broke down when faced with mass mortality. Courts that might normally adjudicate property disputes found themselves dealing with entire villages where everyone was dead and no one was left to claim anything. Laws about inheritance became meaningless when family lines disappeared completely. The careful legal framework that governed medieval property rights collapsed under the weight of universal death. Traditional gender roles around death and mourning dissolved when survival trumped all social conventions. Women who might normally have prepared bodies for burial were too weak to lift corpses. Men who should have dug graves lacked the strength to break frozen ground. Children were pressed into service handling the dead, exposure to mortality that would have been considered inappropriate in normal times, but became necessary when adults were unavailable or incapacitated. The concept of martyrdom, so important in medieval Christianity, took on new and bitter meanings during the famine. People died not for their faith, but despite it, not as holy sacrifices, but as victims of forces beyond anyone's control. The idea that suffering brought one closer to God was tested to its breaking point when suffering seemed to serve no purpose except to cause more suffering. Saints who had once provided comfort in times of trial seemed distant and irrelevant when prayers went unanswered and miracles failed to materialize. Funeral music, those haunting melodies that had traditionally accompanied the dead to their rest, fell silent as musicians died or sold their instruments for food. The songs that had once provided comfort to the grieving were forgotten as communities lost their cultural memory along with their population. Death became a silent affair unmarked by the ritual music that had once helped the living process their loss and celebrate the lives of the departed. Professional services related to death, from coffin makers to stone carvers to funeral directors, simply vanished as both demand overwhelmed supply and payment became impossible. The elaborate death industry that had been slowly developing in medieval Europe disappeared almost overnight, leaving families to handle everything themselves with whatever materials and energy they could muster. Death became a do-it-yourself affair by necessity rather than choice. The location of graves became forgotten as markers disappeared and record keepers died. Burial sites that should have been maintained for centuries were lost within years as survivors fled or died, and no one remained who remembered where bodies had been laid. The connection between the living and their ancestors, so crucial in medieval spirituality, was severed as thoroughly as if the dead had never existed at all. Scavenging among the dead became a necessary survival skill as the living searched corpses for anything useful. Clothes that might provide warmth, tools that might aid in finding food, even gold teeth that might be traded for sustenance. Everything became fair game when the alternative was death. The taboos that had once protected the dignity of the dead evaporated when respecting those taboos meant joining them in their fate. Children born during the worst years of the famine, if they survived at all, grew up in a world where death was more familiar than life. They learned to crawl around corpses before they learned to walk properly. Their first words were often names of dead relatives rather than living ones. They played games that revolved around death and burial rather than the life-affirming activities that had entertained previous generations. Death became their normal, life their exception. The sheer logistics of handling mass mortality overwhelmed communities that had no experience with catastrophe on roads became impassable, due such a scale. Wells became contaminated with corpses to abandoned bodies. Public buildings became morgues not by design, but by default as they filled with the dead. The infrastructure of daily life buckled under the weight of universal dying. creating secondary problems that multiplied the primary disaster. Seasonal patterns of death that had once been predictable, with more people dying in winter and during disease outbreaks, became meaningless when death was constant year-round. The natural rhythms that had governed mortality for centuries were replaced by a steady drumbeat of dying that never paused, never varied, never offered hope that the worst might be over. Death became as reliable as sunrise, and far more frequent. The psychological impact on children who survived was particularly devastating. They learned that adults couldn't protect them from death, that death could come at any time without warning, that everyone they loved would eventually die, and probably sooner rather than later. These lessons, learned at ages when children should have been discovering wonder and joy, created a generation marked by anxiety, depression, and a fundamental mistrust of life itself. Professional clergy found their entire worldview challenged by the scale of death they witnessed. Priests who had once offered comfort with promises of heaven and resurrection now struggled to maintain their own faith when faced with evidence that seemed to suggest God had abandoned his people entirely. Many died alongside their parishioners, others fled their posts, and still others suffered spiritual crises that left them unable to provide the comfort their communities desperately needed. The economic value of human life, always low in medieval society, became essentially zero during the worst years of the famine. People who might once have been valuable as workers or soldiers or taxpayers became burdens whose death was often seen as a relief rather than a loss. The cold calculation of survival meant that even family members began viewing each other in terms of resources consumed rather than love shared. Bodies became so common that they were often used for practical purposes that would have been unthinkable in normal times. Corpses were stacked to block wind, used as fuel when wood was unavailable, even cannibalized when all other food sources were exhausted. The human body, once sacred in Christian theology, became just another resource to be exploited in the desperate struggle to survive. Traditional burial grounds overflowed as new bodies arrived faster than old ones could decompose. Cemeteries that had served communities for centuries filled beyond capacity, forcing survivors to bury new corpses on top of old graves or simply abandon proper burial entirely. The careful organisation of the dead that had characterised medieval burial practices collapsed into chaotic piling of bodies wherever space could be found. Mourning rituals that had helped communities process grief became impossible when there was no time for mourning and no energy for ritual. The elaborate ceremonies that had once marked the transition from life to death were abandoned in favour of quick disposal focused solely on preventing disease. Grief became internalised and private, creating psychological wounds that would never properly heal because they were never properly acknowledged. The concept of a good death, so important in medieval Christianity, became meaningless when most people died alone, unattended, without last rites or final comfort. The spiritual preparation that was supposed to ease the transition to the afterlife became impossible when priests were unavailable and families were too weak to provide proper care. Death became a solitary experience rather than the communal passage it had traditionally been. Professional mourning, the paid expression of grief that had become common in some regions, disappeared entirely as communities lost both the resources to pay mourners and the emotional capacity to engage with grief properly. Sorrow became a luxury that required energy better spent on staying alive. The social processing of death that had helped communities heal from loss was abandoned in favour of emotional numbness that allowed survivors to function despite being surrounded by horror. The transformation of graveyards from peaceful resting places into scenes of horror became one of the famine's most visible symbols. Burial grounds that had once been carefully maintained spaces for reflection and remembrance became overcrowded, chaotic dumping grounds where bodies were piled without ceremony or dignity. The physical landscape of death changed to reflect the spiritual and social collapse that accompanied mass mortality. Animals that had once been trained to avoid human corpses began feeding on them openly as hunger drove all creatures to desperation. Dogs that had once been loyal companions turned feral and hunted in packs through abandoned villages. Cats that had once been pampered pets became scavengers, picking through the remains of their former owners. The natural order that had kept humans separate from and above other animals dissolved when all species were reduced to the same basic struggle for calories. Record-keeping systems that might have helped historians understand the full scope of the catastrophe simply ceased to function as the people responsible for maintaining records died or fled. Parish registers that should have documented every death in their communities went blank for months or years at a time. The careful documentation that was slowly developing in medieval Europe was lost, taking with it much of our ability to understand exactly how many people died and how they lived their final days. Professional services related to death that had been developing in larger cities simply vanished overnight as both practitioners died and demand overwhelmed any possible supply. Funeral directors, coffin makers, grave diggers, all the specialists who had begun to emerge around death in urban areas either died themselves or abandoned their trades when payment became impossible. Death became an amateur affair, handled by whoever remained alive and conscious enough to drag bodies away from the living. The sound of death became as familiar as any other aspect of daily life. The rattling breath of the dying, the wails of the bereaved, the thud of bodies hitting the bottom of mass graves, all became part of the soundtrack of survival. Children learned to sleep through sounds that would have terrified them in normal times. The audio landscape of Europe changed to reflect its transformation into a continent of the dying. Medical knowledge about death and dying, such as it existed in the 14th century, proved completely inadequate when faced with mortality on such a scale. Physicians who understood death as an individual medical event couldn't cope with death as a social phenomenon affecting entire populations. Their training in treating individual patients became useless when everyone was dying simultaneously from the same cause that had no cure. The psychology of anticipating death became a survival skill as people learned to recognize when their own end was approaching. Signs of impending starvation death became familiar to everyone who lived through the famine. People learned to prepare for their own dying, to make whatever arrangements were possible, to say whatever goodbyes could be managed. Death became a process to be managed rather than an event to be feared, because fear required energy that was better spent on preparation. Professional religious guidance about death and the afterlife became scarce as clergy died at rates equal to or higher than their parishioners. Priests who might normally provide comfort and spiritual direction in times of crisis found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer number of people dying around them. Many lost their own faith when faced with suffering that seemed to contradict everything they had been taught about God's love and justice. The economic systems built around death, from inheritance laws to funeral services to memorial practices, simply collapsed when faced with mortality on a scale they were never designed to handle. Legal frameworks that had developed over centuries to deal with individual deaths proved useless when entire families and communities disappeared simultaneously. The careful economic structures that had supported death-related services crumbled along with everything else. Traditional beliefs about the relationship between death and virtue, the idea that good people were rewarded with good deaths while sinners suffered, became impossible to maintain when death struck randomly without regard to moral character. Saints and sinners died in equal numbers and with equal suffering. Children died before adults, the healthy before the sick, the virtuous before the corrupt. Death revealed itself to be an equal opportunity destroyer that respected neither rank nor righteousness. The physical transformation of corpses became a familiar sight as bodies were left unburied for extended periods. People learned to recognize the stages of decomposition, to judge how long a body had been dead by its appearance, to determine whether approaching a corpse was safe or dangerous. Death became not just an event, but a process that continued long after breathing stopped. a process that everyone needed to understand for their own safety. Funeral goods that had traditionally been buried with the dead were instead kept by the living, who needed every possible resource for survival. Jewellery that might once have accompanied bodies to their graves was sold or traded for food. Clothes that would normally have been reserved for burial shrouds were worn by the living who had nothing else. The material culture surrounding death was stripped away and repurposed for the more immediate needs of survival. The concept of mourning periods, those traditional times when communities would focus on grieving and remembering the dead, became impossible to maintain when death was so constant that mourning never ended. There was no time to process grief properly when new losses arrived daily. Communities that should have been healing from their losses instead found themselves in a constant state of fresh trauma that prevented any real recovery. Professional grave goods, the specialised items created specifically for burial, disappeared entirely as craftsmen died or turned their skills to more immediate survival needs. Coffins, headstones, burial clothes, all the material accessories of death were abandoned in favour of whatever could be found or improvised. Death was stripped of its material culture and reduced to its most basic biological reality. The transformation of death from a spiritual event into a purely practical problem represented one of the greatest impacts on medieval Amiens' most profound culture. Death lost its mystery, its dignity, its meaning, becoming instead just another logistical challenge in the daily struggle to survive. The elaborate cultural framework that had grown up around mortality collapsed, leaving communities to face death without the comfort of tradition or ritual. The transformation of human relationships during the Great Famine reached depths that would have been unimaginable in times of plenty. Love itself became a dangerous luxury when caring too much about another person could mean watching them die while being powerless to help. Parents learned to harden their hearts against their children's cries for food they couldn't provide. Husbands and wives began viewing each other not as partners in life, but as competitors for the same meagre resources that might keep one of them alive for another day. The bonds of friendship, those connections that had enriched medieval life with shared joy and mutual support, withered under the relentless pressure of survival. Friends who had once shared everything now hoarded their discoveries of edible roots or scraps of mouldy grain. Trust became impossible when revealing the location of a hidden food cache to even your closest companion might mean returning to find it empty and your survival compromised. The social networks that had once provided comfort and security in difficult times dissolved into suspicious isolation. Romantic love, that flowering of human emotion that had begun to find expression in medieval poetry and song, seemed like a cruel joke when potential lovers were too weak to embrace and too focused on finding their next meal to spare energy for affection. Young people who should have been courting and dreaming of futures together instead competed for the attention of anyone who might have access to food. Beauty became defined not by conventional standards, but by the simple fact of still being alive and relatively healthy. The institution of godparenthood, so important in medieval Christian society, collapsed when godparents could barely care for themselves, much less fulfill their obligations to their godchildren. The spiritual bonds that were supposed to create extended family networks became meaningless when survival required focusing all available resources on immediate blood relatives. Children found themselves abandoned not just by parents who had died, but by godparents who had simply disappeared or chosen to preserve their own families first. Neighbourly cooperation, the informal system of mutual aid that had helped communities weather smaller crises for centuries, broke down completely when helping others meant sacrificing your own family's chances of survival. The barn raisings, harvest help, and shared labour that had bound rural communities together became impossible memories from a better time. Neighbours began viewing each other across property lines not as potential allies but as threats who might discover and steal whatever resources remained hidden. The The elderly, who had once been repositories of wisdom and experience, found themselves transformed into unwanted burdens, whose continued existence competed with the survival chances of younger family members. Grandparents, who had once been honoured and cared for, were quietly abandoned or simply left to die when families could no longer spare the resources to keep them alive. The accumulated knowledge of generations was lost not just through death, but through the deliberate abandonment of those who carried it. Professional relationships that had defined medieval working life disintegrated when there was no work to be done and no payment possible, even if work existed. Master craftsmen found themselves equal to their former apprentices in their helplessness before starvation. Guild structures that had governed trades for generations became meaningless when the trades themselves ceased to exist. The careful hierarchies of skill and experience that had organised medieval labour collapsed into a flat equality of desperation. Religious communities that had once provided models of Christian charity and mutual support found themselves facing the same impossible choices as everyone else. Monasteries that had traditionally opened their doors to travellers and the needy were forced to choose between sharing their dwindling supplies and watching their own communities starve. Some maintained their charitable traditions until the last monk died of hunger. Others barricaded themselves behind their walls and survived while the surrounding countryside emptied of life. The relationship between social classes, already strained by the inequalities of feudal society, underwent radical transformation as starvation proved to be a remarkably effective equalizer. Lords who had once commanded absolute obedience from their serfs found themselves begging for scraps from peasants who had managed to find something edible. The elaborate protocols of deference and respect that had governed interactions between social ranks became absurd when everyone was reduced to the same basic struggle for calories. Marriage contracts that had once been carefully negotiated agreements between families became desperate arrangements between individuals who hoped that two people working together might have better survival chances than either one alone. Dowries and bride prices became impossible concepts when families had nothing to give and no reason to expect their children would live long enough to benefit from careful matrimonial planning. Wedding ceremonies were reduced to simple promises made between people who understood that death might part them within days rather than decades. The bonds between parents and children, supposedly the strongest of all human connections, faced their ultimate test when feeding one child meant condemning another to death. Mothers who had once nursed their infants with love and joy found themselves unable to produce milk due to their own malnutrition. Fathers who had once worked to provide for their families now had to choose which family members deserved the few calories they could find. The natural instinct to protect one's offspring warred with the mathematical reality that resources were simply insufficient to keep everyone alive. Sibling relationships transformed from partnerships in play and growth into competitions for parental attention and scarce resources. Brothers and sisters who had once shared everything now guarded their portions of whatever food could be found. Birth order took on new significance as families were forced to make decisions about which children had the best chances of survival and deserved priority in feeding. The bonds of childhood companionship were strained beyond recognition when companionship became competition. Professional caregiving relationships, from physicians to midwives to those who tended the sick, became impossible to maintain when the caregivers themselves were dying and there was nothing they could do to help their patients anyway. Healers who had once been respected members of their communities found their skills useless against starvation and their traditional payments impossible to collect. The social contract that had supported medical care dissolved when both healers and patients understood that the only real medicine was food that didn't exist between humans. The relationship and domestic animals underwent complete reversal as pets and livestock became food sources rather than companions or working partners. Dogs that had once been beloved family members were slaughtered and eaten without ceremony. Cats that had once been pampered house pets became competitors for the same mice and rats that their owners were trying to catch. The emotional bonds that had connected humans to their animals were severed by the simple necessity of choosing between sentiment and survival. Trading relationships that had connected communities across vast distances collapsed, as there was nothing left to trade and no safe way to transport goods. Even if they had existed, merchants who had once been welcomed in towns and villages became suspected of hoarding or stealing whatever resources they claimed to possess. The commercial networks that had been slowly knitting medieval Europe together were torn apart by suspicion, desperation, and the simple impossibility of maintaining commerce when production had ceased. Educational relationships between teachers and students vanished when there was no energy for learning and no point in acquiring knowledge that wouldn't help with the immediate problem of staying alive. Masters who had once passed on their skills to eager apprentices found themselves with nothing to teach and no one strong enough to learn. The careful transmission of knowledge that had sustained civilization became irrelevant when civilization itself was crumbling around everyone's ears. The relationship between the living and the dead, so carefully maintained in medieval Christian culture through prayers, masses, and memorial practices, was severed by the sheer impossibility of honouring the deceased properly when the living barely had strength to bury them. Families that had once maintained elaborate memorial traditions were forced to abandon their ancestors to unmarked graves and unremembered deaths. The connection between generations was broken as thoroughly as if the dead had never existed. Relationships of authority and obedience that had structured medieval society for centuries became meaningless when authority figures were as helpless as everyone else, and obedience offered no protection from starvation. Kings who had once commanded armies found themselves unable to command enough food to keep their own households alive. The divine right of rulers seemed like a cruel joke when divine providence had apparently abandoned everyone equally. The relationship between communities and their environments transformed from partnership to desperate exploitation, as every possible resource was consumed without regard for future consequences. Forests that had been carefully managed for generations stripped bare of or anything dibble. Fields repeatedly soil-wased have been allowed as plenty that should sustain until the exhausted. The careful balance that had to rest with human communities for centuries was abandoned in favour of immediate consumption that guaranteed future disaster. Professional relationships in law and governance collapsed when there were no laws that could address mass starvation and no government functions that could be maintained without resources. Judges who had once arbitrated disputes found themselves facing situations where law was irrelevant and justice impossible. The careful legal frameworks that had been developing throughout medieval Europe proved useless when survival trumped all other considerations. The relationship between different generations became strained beyond recognition, as older people represented both sources of wisdom and drains on scarce resources. Young adults who should have been learning from their elders instead found themselves making life and death decisions without guidance. Children who should have been protected and nurtured were forced to compete with adults for the same limited resources. Relationships based on shared faith and religious practice faced their ultimate test when prayer seemed ineffective and divine intervention failed to materialize. Congregations that had once gathered for worship found themselves unable to maintain their religious observances when survival required all their attention. The shared beliefs that had bound communities together were challenged by the evidence that God had apparently people to abandon their fate. Economic relationships that had been built on credit, debt, and future expectations collapsed when the future became uncertain and payment impossible. Loans that had been made in good faith became uncollectible when both borrowers and lenders were starving. The complex web of financial obligations that had supported medieval commerce was swept away by the simple reality that money couldn't buy what didn't exist. The relationship between humans and the natural world shifted from cooperation to desperate competition as people found themselves fighting the elements, not just for comfort, but for basic survival. Weather became an enemy to be feared rather than a natural force to be worked with. The seasonal rhythms that had governed human life for millennia became sources of dread rather than anticipation. Relationships of protection and dependency, from lords protecting vassals to parents protecting children, became impossible to maintain when protectors were as vulnerable as those they were supposed to shield. The entire feudal system was built on the premise that those with power would protect those without it in exchange for service and loyalty. When power proved useless against starvation, the system collapsed and left everyone equally exposed to forces beyond anyone's control. Professional relationships in crafts and trades that had been built up over years of apprenticeship and guild membership dissolved when there was no work to be done and no materials to work with. Master craftsmen found their skills irrelevant when survival required different talents entirely. The careful hierarchies of expertise that had organised medieval production became meaningless when production itself had ceased. The relationship between different communities and regions transformed from cooperation and trade to competition and suspicion as each group focused on its own survival without regard for neighbours. Towns that had once welcomed travellers began turning away refugees who might consume scarce resources. The broader identities that had begun to emerge in medieval Europe were replaced by narrow tribal loyalties that extended no further than one's immediate survival group. Relationships based on honour and reputation, so important in medieval culture, became impossible to maintain, when honourable behaviour often meant death and reputation couldn't be eaten. Knights who had built their identities around codes of chivalry found themselves stealing food from peasants. Merchants who had prided themselves on honest dealing began hoarding and price gouging when the alternative was watching their families starve. The relationship between present and future that drives all human activity was planning and hoping severed by the immediate urgency of survival. People who had once saved for the future instead consumed everything immediately. The investment in tomorrow that characterises civilised society became impossible when tomorrow's survival was never guaranteed. Family relationships that had been governed by custom and tradition adapted to new realities where survival trumped sentiment. Extended family networks that had once provided security and support became burdens when resources were insufficient to support anyone's immediate beyond nuclear families. The obligations and loyalties that had defined family life were abandoned when maintaining them meant death for everyone involved. The relationship between urban and rural communities reversed as cities became death traps, dependent on countryside that could no longer support them. Urban dwellers who had once looked down on rural peasants found themselves begging for admission to farming communities that might have access to whatever food remained. The economic relationships that had connected town and country were severed when there was nothing left to buy or sell. Professional relationships in religious hierarchies collapsed when bishops and priests were as likely to starve as their parishioners, and divine authority offered no protection from hunger. The elaborate structures of church governance became irrelevant when basic spiritual care became impossible to provide. Clergy who had once commanded respect through their spiritual authority found themselves reduced to the same desperate struggle as everyone else. The relationship between individual desire and community need transformed as survival required abandoning personal wants in favour of whatever actions might keep the group alive. Privacy became impossible when every decision affected everyone's chances of survival. The individual identity that was slowly emerging in medieval culture was submerged again in the collective struggle against extinction. Relationships based on mutual benefit and reciprocity became impossible when no one had anything to give and everyone needed to receive. The gift economies that had supplemented market relationships in medieval society disappeared when there were no gifts to give. Social obligations that had once bound communities together became meaningless when fulfilling them meant sacrificing survival. The relationship between work and reward, fundamental to any functioning society, was completely severed when there was no work that could produce food, and no rewards available even for the most essential labour. People who had once taken pride in their contributions to their communities found themselves unable to contribute anything meaningful when the only meaningful contribution was finding food that didn't exist. Professional relationships that had developed around specialised knowledge became worthless when that knowledge proved irrelevant to the problem of mass starvation. Scholars who had devoted their lives to learning found their education useless. Craftsmen who had mastered complex skills discovered that their expertise meant nothing when raw materials were unavailable and no one could afford their products. The relationship between different age groups within traditional families became strained as patterns of care and respect broke down under the pressure of resource competition. Elderly parents who had expected care from their adult children instead found themselves abandoned. Young children who should have been protected by their elders instead competed with them for the same scarce resources. Marriage relationships that had been expected to last until death was parted by death much sooner than anyone had anticipated, but also by abandonment as spouses chose survival over loyalty. Wedding vows about remaining together in sickness and health proved impossible to honour when sickness meant starvation and health was a luxury no one could afford to maintain in others. The relationship between communities and their traditional leaders collapsed when leadership proved unable to provide the one thing that mattered: food. Village headmen, guildmasters, and local nobles found their authority evaporating when they couldn't deliver solutions to the fundamental problem everyone faced. New forms of leadership emerged based not on traditional authority, but on whoever could find food or organise survival efforts. Relationships between different social groups that had been maintained through careful protocols and mutual obligations dissolved when survival made such niceties impossible. The elaborate etiquette that had governed interactions between classes became absurd when everyone was reduced to the same basic struggle. Social climbing became irrelevant when there was nowhere to climb to and nothing to climb for. The relationship between humans and their built environment changed as buildings became sources of fuel rather than shelter, and possessions became potential food sources rather than markers of status. Houses were dismantled for firewood, furniture was burned for warmth, and anything that could be eaten was consumed regardless of its original purpose. The material culture that had supported medieval life was systematically destroyed in the desperate search for anything that might aid survival. Professional relationships in government and administration became impossible to maintain when there were no resources to support bureaucracy and no functions of government that could address the fundamental problem everyone faced. Tax collectors found nothing to collect, judges found no law that could solve starvation, and administrators discovered that administration required resources that no longer existed. The relationship between different generations of women was particularly strained as traditional patterns of mutual support among mothers, daughters, and sisters broke down when helping others meant sacrificing one's own children. The networks of female cooperation that had helped women survive the particular challenges of medieval life were torn apart by the impossible choices that starvation forced upon everyone. Sleep became both refuge and torment during the Great Famine, as exhausted bodies craved rest but empty stomachs made comfortable sleep impossible. People would lie awake for hours in the darkness, too hungry to drift off, but too weak to remain active, existing in a twilight state between consciousness and oblivion. When sleep finally came, it brought dreams so vivid and cruel that many preferred to stay awake rather than face the crushing disappointment of waking to reality. The dreams were always about food, elaborate feasts that seemed absolutely real, tables groaning under the weight of roasted meats, fresh bread, ripe fruits, and flowing wine. Dreamers would taste every morsel, feel the satisfaction of a full belly, experience the joy of abundance. Then consciousness would return like a physical blow, bringing with it the gnawing emptiness that had become the soundtrack of existence. Some people began to fear sleep itself, knowing that each dream of plenty would make the waking reality that much more unbearable. Sleep patterns changed dramatically as malnutrition affected brain chemistry. The normal rhythms of rest and activity broke down when the body lacked the energy for either. People would doze fitfully during the day when sunlight offered some warmth, then lie wakeful through the long cold nights when darkness amplified every sensation of hunger and despair. Children who had once slept soundly through the night now woke crying for food that didn't exist, their small voices echoing through houses where parents had nothing to offer but empty embraces. The sounds of the night changed as communities emptied and normal activities ceased. The familiar noises that had once provided comfort, the distant lowing of cattle, the rustle of small animals in the thatch, the quiet conversations of neighbours settling in for the night, all faded into an oppressive silence. Instead, the darkness filled with sounds that had never been heard before. The moans of the starving, the death rattles of the dying, the scratch of desperate claws as surviving animals fought over scraps. Bedtime rituals that had once marked the peaceful end of each day became exercises in futility. There were no evening meals to share, no stories to tell by the fire, no prayers of gratitude for the day's blessings. Instead, families huddled together in whatever warmth they could find, trying to conserve energy for another day of searching for food that probably wouldn't be found. The gentle routines that had eased the transition from day to night disappeared, replaced by the grim calculation of whether everyone would still be breathing when morning came. The very concept of a good night's rest became a luxury from a forgotten age. Beds that had once provided comfort and security became places where people waited to die, too weak to rise, too uncomfortable to truly rest. Straw mattresses that hadn't been changed in months harboured insects and decay. Blankets became so precious that families fought over who deserved them most, leading to bitter arguments that consumed energy no one could spare. Dreams began to blur with hallucinations as prolonged malnutrition affected mental function. People reported seeing deceased relatives who called to them from beyond, offering food and comfort that existed only in minds damaged by starvation. These visions became so compelling that some individuals would wander off into the night, following phantom figures toward imaginary feasts, only to be found days later, dead from exposure, their faces wearing expressions of strange contentment. The boundary between sleeping and waking became increasingly meaningless as consciousness itself grew unstable. People would find themselves unsure whether conversations had actually happened or been dreamed, whether food they remembered eating had been real or imagined, whether loved ones they thought they'd seen were still alive or had joined the growing ranks of the dead. Reality became as unreliable as sleep, leaving survivors adrift in a world where nothing could be trusted, not even their own perceptions. Nightmares, when they came, were often preferable to the supposed good dreams because at least they matched the horror of waking reality. People dreamed of being chased by wolves, of drowning in icy water, of being buried alive, and these terrors seemed merciful compared to dreams of abundance that made awakening an agony. The sleeping mind, damaged by starvation, could no longer provide the escape that rest was supposed to offer. Children developed sleep disorders that would mark them for life, their developing brains permanently altered by the trauma of constant hunger. Those who survived learned to associate darkness with danger, bedtime with fear, dreams with cruel disappointment. The simple pleasure of falling asleep peacefully became a skill that an entire generation never learned, creating adults who would struggle with rest even when food became available again. The rhythm of day and night lost its meaning when every hour brought the same suffering. People slept when they collapsed from exhaustion, and woke when cold or pain made rest impossible. The natural cycle that had governed human life since the dawn of time was broken, replaced by an irregular pattern of unconsciousness and awareness that followed no schedule except the body's failing systems. Families developed strategies for managing sleep when sharing warmth was essential for survival, but space was limited and tempers were frayed by hunger. Parents would take turns staying awake to tend whatever fire could be maintained, while children were arranged like puzzle pieces to maximize shared body heat. The logistics of rest became as complex as any other aspect of survival, requiring planning and cooperation that grew more difficult as starvation affected everyone's ability to think clearly. The fear of not waking up became a nightly terror that kept many people from sleeping deeply, even when exhaustion demanded rest. Every night brought the possibility that morning would find another body among the living, and everyone understood that their own death might come quietly during the vulnerable hours of sleep. This awareness created a cruel paradox where rest was desperately needed, but terrifying to embrace fully. The Great Famine stands as one of history's most brutal reminders that survival often comes down to nothing more than chance. No amount of courage, intelligence, or moral character could guarantee your family would see spring when winter stretched endlessly, and every sunrise brought only the promise of more suffering. In a world where children learned to step over corpses and dreams of bread became more precious than gold, the line between civilization and chaos proved thinner than anyone had imagined. This wasn't just hunger, it was the complete unravelling of everything medieval Europe thought it understood about life, death, and divine providence.